Thanks, David. First and foremost, I think I just want to open up by saying, how proud we are of Dale Jr. and the entire team. It takes a lot of guts for an athlete of his caliber, where he stands in the sport, where he stood in the chase, to come up here, admit he had an issue. It's everyone's responsibility in this sport to participate in the safety of all of our athletes. It's on the athlete, the owner, NASCAR, the tracks, and I think you saw the process work in terms of Dale Jr. knowing he had an issue, seeking out Dr. Petty, who sits on our advisory board, and taking the right steps. No matter how tough it is, I think he represents what you'd want in an athlete and represents the sport well. So, our primary concern is obviously Dale's health, and seeing him back in the race car. I think you heard today from Dr. Petty that things look good to be able to do that. So we're encouraged by what we've heard as well. And we're going to leave it up to Dr. Petty, as you heard today, to make the final decision on when Dale Jr. can be back in a race car, as we would with any concussion symptoms that we've received from drivers. That's our normal process, where if a driver is evaluated or seen by a doctor, we rely on a neurologist with at least 5 years experience in the sports field to evaluate the athlete or the driver to get back in the sport. And Dr. Petty obviously has years of experience in that. He's been around this sport a long, long time. He's been around a number of sports, and we're going to rely on him to make that decision and go from there. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
We'll start with Jen, and then we'll go to Viv, and then Bob.
Jennifer, AP. Steve, this question's not as antagonistic as it's going to sound. You said that the process worked, but the fact is Junior had a concussion after Kansas and didn't see, was able to sort of hide that or keep that to himself, and possibly could have done it again. So is there something that NASCAR can do to ensure that drivers are getting treated or examined at least after these types of incidents?
No, I think that's a fair question, Jenna, and I think it would probably help to go back to Kansas and what happened. Dale Jr. was seen by an ambulance, an advanced life support ambulance. Proper safety measures were in place. He was cleared. I've talked to Pat Warren at the track. He had conversations with Junior. Post-incident, everything seemed fine. So that's where I would say the process of an evaluation for any athlete or driver is not just NASCAR making the call. It has to be the driver as well, letting us know, how he's feeling. And part of that, we can always evaluate, as we will. We'll look at Kansas and see what we may be able to do better. We do that with safety each and every incident. But you heard some of the things with the incident data recorder we had on the car, so we're able to look at that. We're able to evaluate it. But I think we've got to also rely on the drivers to be upfront with us and let us know, and I think you saw him do that here today. We do have our medical liaison team who brings every driver's records from when they've raced with us to every event, so we know what's going on. We know their history. We can evaluate them from there. But I think it's something we'll obviously take a look at, but I think we really applaud the move he made today to take that step.
To Viv.
It is. Advanced life support would mean, they could administer anything they need and evaluate him, yes.
Go to Viv.
Viv Bernstein, New York Times. When you see an incident like this, two concussions, Eric McClure's concussions, I'm not here every week to know all of the injuries, but I know Keselowski broke an ankle. Do you now have concerns about the safety of the car?
I think Dale Jr. Answered that best. I think we're very confident in the safety of our cars, but we look at them candidly as a rolling laboratory. Each and every event, we try and learn something new and make them as safe as possible. And I'd say our race cars are the safest in the world. I think when you look at the concussion history that we've had, even over the last 5 years, we've had a total of 9 concussions in our national series in 5 years. It's less than 2 per year. And when you look at the number of events we run per weekend in trucks and nationwide and Cup, that's a pretty small number. And I don't want to minimize that because any concussion is a cause for concern, and we'd like that number to be 0. But I think our overall safety record, the fact that our R&D center is the only thing that exists in motorsports to evaluate every crash, to look at what we can do better, the experts we have on staff back at the R&D center, I think I'd put our safety record up against anyone.
Okay, we'll go with Bob, then over to Nate, and then back over to Claire B. Lang.
Bob Parker, Sporting News. I mean, Dale Jr. said his Kansas wreck was 40 Gs. If you had that information from your data recorder, wouldn't that make you want to have somebody check him out a couple of days later, 3 days later, 5 days later to make sure he's okay?
Yeah, Bob, I think, looking back, there's always things you can second guess and look at. I think that's one of the things we'll evaluate as we go forward. But I think, again, I'd put it back on, everybody's got a responsibility as part of this. That's something we can learn from as well. And I'm sure in talking to Dale Jr., as we have, knowing where we stand now, that'll absolutely be part of the procedures that we look at moving forward.
Nate Ryan, USA Today. Steve, I know you said you're going to leave this up to Dr. Jerry Petty, but does NASCAR have any concerns about the fact that in 2002, Dale Earnhardt Jr. admitted that he raced with a concussion for a couple of months? He intimated just now that he'd had a few concussions and still let the symptoms clear and then race that weekend. Are you going to be any more vigilant about the fact that there's a pattern there? And does it concern NASCAR at all that drivers seem to be allowed to make those decisions on their own without having an independent objective test that you administer to make sure that they're okay to race against 42 other guys if they're had their bell rung?
Yeah, Nate, let me kind of clear some things up. I think a driver is cleared every year to race. So before they even get in the car in Daytona, the drivers have been seen. We know their medical history. So that's first and foremost going into a year. I think what you heard Junior say is he didn't recall. I think he referenced the 2002, and then he's had 2 here. So what I would say is surely moving forward, we're going to rely on Dr. Petty with knowing the history, knowing the baseline. If there is an incident at the track, we have that data. We can evaluate it. If we think there's a reason, or if the medical liaisons and the staff in the care center believe he should be sent for further evaluation, we will do that. And I think we've got a pretty good history of sending drivers to the care center and then also to a neurologist if we think there may be any cause to do so. I think, going back to your question on, do drivers try and cover it up? I think you saw, Mr. Hendrick talk about maybe 10 years ago what the situation was, but I think you saw a driver who's racing for a championship, who's our most popular driver, get up here and go see a doctor and get out of a car. It takes a lot of guts. I think it also shows where our sports come, and I think they know that safety is first and foremost. We know it's a dangerous sport, but we've got to be relying on our drivers to be up front with us, and I think for the most part they are, and we have that good relationship to continue forward.
Okay, we'll go 1, 2, and then Kenny Bruce.
Claire B. Lang, Sirius XM NASCAR Radio. Thanks for coming in here, Steve. At Talladega, because he was able to get the car back to the garage, Dale didn't have to go to the care center. Is there any thought that you would require guys to go anyway after a hit that you saw, to be checked out? And how can you continue to change the mentality of the athletes to be honest and forward about this?
I think to answer your first question, I think the challenge for us, Claire, is every hit subjective. So if we required every driver to go to the care center, let's take Dale Jr. in this instance. If it was lap 40 and he seemed fine and drove the car in and they had a quick adjustment in 5 laps and could get him back out there and he felt fine, have we then cost a driver a championship, or are you asking me the opposite question? So it's very tough. It's still a subjective call. It's something we do take a look at week in and week out. So, we'll continue to do that, but I think the policy, and we have sent drivers to the care center when they have hit during a race and been able to drive it back, and we've evaluated that. What was the second question, Claire?
How you could encourage the athletes to continue in this era of concussions in sports, to be honest, and come to you, and even if their ride is in jeopardy.
Yeah, no, I think to answer that, it probably starts in Daytona that I referenced with Nate. We have a driver safety meeting every year in Daytona where we bring in our experts to talk to our drivers about what we've learned in the past year, any new safety elements we've had. What you've seen from that, obviously, over the years, the safer barrier, the Hans device, new helmets, seats, all those things have been updates we've talked to drivers about. We've worked with the teams and tried to implement as quickly as we can. So those are things we do on really a weekly basis if necessary, but more importantly, every year we have that forum with the drivers, their teams, to make sure it's as safe as possible going forward.
Over here to Kenny Bruce. And we'll take a couple more after that.
Kenny Bruce, Sporting News, NASCAR Illustrated. Steve, you talk about the safety record for NASCAR, and I don't think anybody can argue with that. But to your knowledge, has NASCAR ever sat a driver down because of medical concerns resulting from an injury?
We actually have, Kenny, and I would say that the toughest call would be Rick Crawford. And if you look at 2005, he had the longest streak in the trucks, was ready to break it, had an incident. It was evaluated in the care center, saw a neurologist, and we chose to say no. And that was by the doctor's orders. Very tough call. I think Rick probably still is not talking to some of us sometimes. But I would probably point to that as an example that sticks out with a driver who had been in the car for a long time, or excuse me, the truck, had set a streak, and unfortunately we had to sit him out.
Okay, last couple of questions. Dustin here, and then we'll go way to the back, and that'll be it. Thanks.
Dustin Long, USA Today. Steve, you've referenced, it's been referenced that I guess a neurosurgeon with 5 years experience or more, can clear a driver. What other things are part of the concussion policy that they have to go through? I know Dr. Petty talked about some things similar to the NFL, but can you take us through at this point? Obviously, the concussion policy doesn't kick through until it's been diagnosed. So if a driver's hidden it, you don't know about it, or if you don't have them go see it. So what happens from this point forward, or what happens from the point of a driver getting concussion? What is the policy in detail, and what before they get back on the track?
Yeah, Dustin, I think if you take an incident, let's say here at Charlotte, if a driver were to have an incident, first and foremost is evaluated in the infield care center, where we've got board certified emergency technicians, or doctors, I'm sorry, and they will evaluate the driver at that point. If the driver complains of any symptoms, or if the emergency room physician believes there may be symptoms, we will refer them to a neurologist. In most cases, it is Dr. Petty. Drivers have a lot of trust in Dr. Petty. He's worked with the NFL, obviously with the Panthers, and NASCAR has that relationship. So at that point, he's required to go through the tests that you heard Dr. Petty lay out. Then it's up to our neurologists to make the call on whether or not that driver's going to be back. NASCAR, we take ourselves candidly out of that, and we rely on our doctors to make the call on whether or not the driver can be back. So in some cases, it could be 2 weeks, and some it could be less. Some it could be longer, like Eric McClure. It's really a case-by-case basis based on a driver's history or lack thereof, and what the doctor tells us.
Surgeon. So, thanks. Does that mean that Dr. Petty's got to present his information to somebody else? And there was also mention of an advisory board. Can you kind of explain what that is?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Petty would be the neurologist who would evaluate it. It's Dr. Petty, who also works with Dr. Deschmark, who is here, who's part of our advisory board as well. So that's usually who we would refer anyone to with a potential head injury or concussion. And at that point, again, Dustin, it's up to them to clear them, and we rely on their expertise.
Okay, we'll wrap it up with Stan in the back.
Stan Creekmore with RPMtonight.com. I seem to remember from all the years in NASCAR that NASCAR, from a federal standpoint, is totally different than the NFL and baseball and such, because these are independent contractors. So does that limit to some degree what NASCAR can do in a situation like this?
I don't think so. I think, our safety record's pretty clear. I think our drivers are very confident in what we have in place each and every weekend, especially here at Charlotte. If you looked at the safety measures that are in place, the personnel NASCAR has on board, the relationships that the drivers have between our officials, the safety workers at track, our liaison team, our advisory panel, who are the doctors. So I think, if anything, it offers us an even better relationship, because unlike other sports, we've got 43 drivers who are here each and every weekend. They see the same folks. They're used to the same folks at the track. The ambulance personnel who saw Dale Jr. in Kansas had worked the same corner for 12 straight years. They know that racetrack, so I think that familiarity really helps us and possibly gives us an advantage as well.